What's up, Colorado Springs? Today's episode is not going to be your typical deal analysis. We're talking about one deal. This will be a much more of a macro or bigger picture about a few transactions and an investor's journey. Really cool story here that I think a lot of people can relate to or learn from. So our guest a number of years ago bought two out-of-state properties, one in Indianapolis and one in Jacksonville. And then those properties weren't performing as planned, and then did two separate 1031 exchanges back to Colorado Springs recently, and did some analyses on long-term rentals, medium-term rentals, and it's a great episode with pros and cons of investing out of state and bringing properties and equity back to Springs and comparing options we have out here. So, of course, got my co-host, Jenny Bayless. Jenny, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited to speak with our guest today.
I know, this is going to be fun. And our guest is Ken Hobbick. And Ken and I actually connected, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, Ken. Have stayed in touch. And now it's been really cool to see these transactions. So welcome to the podcast, man. Excited to have you.
Yes, thanks for having me.
So kind of just jumping into it. I think in 2015, you bought your first place out of state in Indianapolis. Just give us a little background as to who you are, where you're at, and that first purchase you made.
Sure. Well, my first exposure came to real estate investing when I moved out of state and I rented out my primary residence. And that was a really great experience, and the great tenants, and took great care of it. And that's what initially got me involved into the real estate aspect. But one of the reasons—
And that was here in Denver, right? Your primary?
Yes. Yeah. In Denver. So I kind of had the feeling that I was wanting to move back to Denver. So we kept it, and I'm very glad we did. But that allowed us to have the kind of the foresight to invest out of state, and then also to have some experience with property managers and investing up from a long distance. The difficulty was when you're working with a out-of-state investing, that you're completely relied on by the property manager, and it's very difficult. So they were lower price point properties, and they're supposed to be cash flow positive. But over the course of the 4 to 5 years that I owned them, they were both cash flow negative. And it was astonishing how similar both of them were in Indianapolis and Jacksonville. They're both the same.
In what way?
I initially bought them both for right around $120,000. They both rented for about $1,200 a month. They both had to have evictions within the first one was 1 month, and then the second one was 6 months. So the first tenants had to go through an eviction. They both had higher expenses and a lot of maintenance and a lot of turnover, even though they were both, they were rehabbed and they were completed. So it was one of those that I didn't see the performance of them getting any better, especially being out of state, that I couldn't take control of it and do anything to help that aspect. So.
Jenny, does this resonate with any experience or memories on your out-of-state investing?
Yeah, it sounds vaguely familiar, or also pretty much identical to to my out-of-state investing as well. I know Ken and I have had a lot of conversations about the out-of-state properties and everything, and it's just kind of one of those. It fits everything on paper, but then in practice, it just doesn't really work out. Like, it meets the 1% rule that everyone, swears by. And on paper, it looks like it's going to just be, easy sailing and, hey, it's been rehabbed. Like, we'll just get some good tenants in there and they'll stay there forever and we'll have yearly rent increases. Well, none of that happens in actuality. So I can very much relate to Ken's out-of-state investing experience personally.
So, you bought these properties, Indianapolis 2015, Jacksonville was 2017, and I think it was 2020 or 2021 you did the 1031s.
Right at the end of 2020, going into 2021 was the first one that we did. And then the second one was also in 2021. So I did one in June and one in January.
So let's talk about the first one in June. Was that from Jacksonville or Indianapolis?
The first one was from Indianapolis. And then that one, I just purchased a single family residence in Colorado Springs. And then that one's just a part of the portfolio that's been doing great, great tenants in there. The difference was that they didn't get evicted right after, within the first 2 weeks of taking over the property. So that one's been just performing and doing a great job. And then the second one.
Actually, before we talk about the second one, I want to talk about the first one some more, because yeah, you said a few sentences, and 1031s are stressful events and big deals. So
yes,
you bought the place for $120,000, you said, out of state?
Yes.
How is it like when you sold it? What was the price? What was the sales price? And what'd you have to do to kind of set up the 1031?
Well, that was well, even going back to like the out-of-state investing, I'm glad I did it, because that allows options in the future. And real estate's very forgiving in a lot of aspects over time that you erase that. So that allowed me the option to do the 1031. So initially I sold that first Indianapolis property for, I think, right around 170. And then having the 1031, because the market was so crazy at that time, is that we wanted to set everything up as much as possible and do everything in advance and have all our ducks in a row for that to happen. Because once that clock starts on 1031, you're there. That's very unforgiving. So we were even looking at a lot of properties, and almost to the point where we wanted to put contingent offers on them, and for the sale of other ones, or if it would be worthwhile putting any offers in until it actually went under contract. But once that went under contract, that's when we really started looking for properties on the market to make sure that we were able to close in that time.
Okay. And Jenny, with 1031 exchanges, it's like the measure twice, cut once type of motto, where a lot of prep work comes in. So what was it like coordinating things from your perspective on here in the Springs leg?
Yeah, I think for every 1031 exchange we do, I grow a gray hair because I'm always worried, about the timelines and everything. But Ken and I we once he listed his Indianapolis property, we just stayed in very, very close communication. I think we did throw out a couple contingent offers, if I remember correctly, and those didn't really work out. But as soon as he sold his relinquished property, we came across the property that he ended up purchasing, and it kind of worked out really well because we found it in a part of the MLS that someone wouldn't typically look for what he was looking for. So that's why I think we were able to jump on it, and just usual writing a super clean contract. I don't believe really anything came up on inspection. It was a beautiful home, fairly new construction, great tenants. So it thankfully worked out really well.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Now the second property, that was about 6 months later. How was that transaction?
That one was a little bit rougher because Jacksonville property had it was an older home, so there was more inspection issues that came up. So it fell out of contract a couple of times on the selling side. But once it closed and we got it under contract, then that's where we were able to really look at townhouses and look at and identify the second property. I believe the second property was a new build that was under construction, and because of all of the significant construction delays, that would have really put stress on the timeline for the 1031. But this particular townhouse fell out of contract, so it was probably 60 to 70% easily almost to completion. So we were anticipating that it would be completed and be able to take possession of it, so it wouldn't fall out of the 1031 timeline of that one.
Yep.
So that was a townhouse, and when we initially came about and looked at it, I was looking at it as a long-term tenant or a long-term rental, and that one was located in the Security Widefield, South Colorado Springs area.
And so what was the kind of the basic purchase price on that? Like, what did you sell Jacksonville for, and you purchased this new property for about what?
Well, how I mentioned, both of them were very similar. I sold the Jacksonville property for about $170,000 as well.
Really?
Give or take. Yeah, it was eerie how close they were together. So I took all of that money down and used that for the down payment. And the townhouse in Security Widefield at the time was $273 purchase price.
Okay.
And then that equity allowed me to also put 25% down, which helps with the cash flow, and I wouldn't have to pay any and the taxes on that having a
Nice.
5% down. And then that one was also looked at initially as a long-term rental. And I think I pretty much, I think when Jenny sent me the performer or the spreadsheet, having other rental properties in the area, I think I decided I was going to buy that one before I even saw it. Once I drove down.
Why? Like, what stood out to you so much?
Just the cap rate was 6.1, and it was a positive cash flow. So I was going from
I'm good with those criteria.
negative cash flow to positive cash flow. And I think at the closing table, it was very little money out of pocket that was that I had to set aside to do that once all the closing costs and everything were completed.
Yeah, for a brand new home. So, 1 year bumper to bumper warranty from the builder as well. So just, a delay in your tax, assessment. So just a couple little cherries on top as well.
Yes. And being a new build was also very appealing. Just to having, going through the spreadsheet and how much maintenance and repairs and replacements I had done on all the other properties, having a warranty and new build sounded great.
So I got a bunch of questions for you. The first one is, let's talk about this pivot to medium-term rental, because that's become, really popular last year or 2 years as prices have gone up, and especially now as interest rates have gone up, even more so since you bought this property. Anything investors can do to, get more cash flow is on, more and more people's radar. So yeah, it talks about the medium-term rental strategy and evolution.
Sure. So one of the reasons I was moving to Colorado Springs too is so I could self-manage and have more involvement into this. So I was willing to take that on. And then also I live in the southern end of Denver, so I can be in Colorado Springs relatively quicker than I can be in northern Colorado.
Yep.
But somewhere between the closing time, right around there, that's when I came across the medium-term rental. So I looked at that as a way to increase the cash flow, but not being so labor intensive as a short-term rental. So it's almost a split between those two, and I was willing to take that on and go through the process and invest that way, because it could increase the cash flow with a little bit more work, but not so much that it's going to be overwhelming and I wouldn't get the higher returns of the short-term rental. So one of the ways I really looked at that is like, well, what's the worst that can happen? Well, the worst that can happen is that, it goes unrented. It's in a really bad area, or, for corporate rentals, and you have a lot of new furniture. So I would look at that as like, what is the investment of furnishing it? And then also with the labor intensive of how much it's going to take to operate it, and the expenses and the time involved in that. And what I was finding is that typically the average tenant would be on the 2 to 3 month range. And of course, with the medium-term rental, you have to do at least 30 days plus to fall into that category and avoid all the short-term rental laws. So that's where I really looked at it as like, well, I could increase the cash flow and also increasing the workload, and then all to counterbalance that. And then of course you get the same appreciation and everything else that you have just owning the property as well.
Yeah. So Jen, I'm curious, like you, I mean, you've been, I'd say, pretty involved in medium-term rental transactions and rentals last, I don't know, year and a half, 2 years now. What's your input and advice, looking at medium-term rentals and just observing what Ken's done with this property?
Yeah, I mean, Ken nailed it in terms of what the risks are, in the way that he was looking at it. So I don't really have anything to add on top of that. I definitely want to get to, bottom line, what was his actual experience with medium-term rentals? And then Ken, if you could also somehow quantify like headache factor for everyone as well, even though, it's a little subjective.
Yeah. And that's also a deciding factor in there. But what I found, so the South Colorado Springs townhouse, it makes a really good long-term rental for multiple reasons. But to move it into a medium-term rental, it has the increased workload, but then it also, since it made such a good long-term rental, it wasn't able to improve it that much to really justify the increased work. So what I found is that going on the pro forma and then the actuals, so I started out and had the South Colorado Springs townhouse, and I furnished that, and then I found some marketing platforms that would find tenants, help with property management. But once you included like all of the utilities and mileage, and then also the vacancy was somewhat hard to determine off of the pro forma. If you take your regular long-term rental pro forma and you put like 8% or 10%, or how to really gauge that when you're deciding to do that. And then the actuals that I had, I would just take what the bottom line was for what the rent would be. So for instance, if it rented for $3,400 a month, I would just take the actual how often it was occupied, since the turnover is from 2 to 3 months. So then that drops the average of the rental down to like $2,800 a month. So with the increased expenses and the property management or the marketing platforms and some of the other expenses, it was doing better, but it wasn't doing that much better to justify a medium term in that location, because it's in South Colorado Springs. So that's a great one for long term. So really what I had done is I think I had gained enough knowledge and interest in the medium term to saying, yeah, there's something here. This is worthwhile. So that's when we started looking for the townhouse in northern Colorado Springs.
Oh, yeah. I love everything that you just said. So like a couple of things. So, one of Chris's favorite sayings is the juice isn't worth the squeeze. So I think that would be a perfect description for your experience with, evaluating the difference between the medium-term rental and a long-term rental, especially for this location. That's something that we've been saying a lot to our clients lately, especially with interest rates rising and all that, is that, it is a few $100s a month in cash flow really worth the extra job essentially that you're taking on. And in most cases, I would say most people would be able to, get that extra couple $100s via their day job, picking up some extra work or something of that nature that's not quite as time intensive as running a totally separate business such as a medium-term rental. So that's a really interesting way to look at it for that. And then Ken, we often get questions of who who is renting medium-term rentals. So could you vaguely describe like the type of tenant that you guys got down there?
Sure. Well, actually, both tenants were in between houses. So they were looking for somewhere to stay while their new house was being completed. And they needed a bridge to stay at over that time period. So and that was one of the areas, like in the South Colorado Springs, because there were not as many businesses or for corporate travel, or hospitals are another big one for the corporate travels. And that's where I kind of looked at it as it could do better, I think, but the location is a little bit more important for the medium-term rental. And that's where I was looking at, is like, wow, I wish I could have that townhouse in northern Colorado Springs. But since I really bought that townhouse for the long-term rental, that's where I was looking at, is like, well, I would like a corporate or a medium-term rental in northern Colorado Springs. And then I may or may not want to keep that one in South Colorado Springs. So
great. Could we jump ahead and talk about what the long-term rental performance of this one ended up being, and we'll kind of fill in the blanks between how we got from medium-term to long-term rental?
Sure. Let me see. Do you want to go over the numbers, or the?
We can just do general, like how it compared to when you first purchased it. What you were thinking in terms of performance on that, and then now that it is a long-term rental, how things are going to that end, and whether you intend on keeping it that way.
Yeah. So I think when I initially started with the medium-term rental, I was expecting to move that up to a cap rate of 7.5%, and then almost doubling the cash flow. So in reality of what happened, there was higher expenses, the marketing platforms, and I didn't want to rely just on one marketing platform. So you have the initial startup costs and the conversion costs, but then ongoing of those marketing platforms or property management that go along. And then those were higher than I expected or anticipated. And then also the vacancy, which you always have to attend for that. And if you're going on medium-term rental, it's not going to be rented 100% of the time. So you have to account for that as well. So it didn't perform as well as I thought it would. So then when it converted back to a long-term rental, or I suppose it started as a long-term rental and then converting back to a long-term rental. So it has a cap rate of 5.9% now, and it easily cash flows $6,500 a month. And then also the hassle factor in that is that it's long-term. I don't have to find tenants or be concerned about tenant turnover every 3 months or so. So that one's just kind of set. And I took that into consideration of the overall portfolio, where I have a mixture of kind of long-term stable rents that are just like the boring kind, that they're long-term tenants. And then also to have a mixture of like, well, you could take some or one or however many you want to bite off and chew and turn those into medium-term rentals, depending on your workflow and how much you could increase the cash flow on that.
So this has been great, especially kind of doing the story arc of, going out of state, coming here, bouncing around. So I'm curious, looking forward, because we all know real estate investing it's a long game. We don't get rich in a year, don't get rich in a two. We're constantly adapting the market. The market's changing. Sometimes we have properties that, we learn from, we move on from. Now that you have experience with out-of-state investing, medium-term rental investing, how is that shaping what you're doing? And I'd love if you could weave in just some like tidbits or advice for other people who, there where you were at 5 years ago considering this stuff, because now you have, you got some wisdom to pass along.
Yeah. Well, I don't regret out-of-state investing because it started the whole process. And then once you start that process, then you have options, or there's so many different options that you can open yourself up to that you wouldn't normally have if you wouldn't do that. But it's really difficult to do out-of-state investing because you're so reliant on property managers, and you're not there, and you got to really have somebody trusted on site. And it really does make a difference to be able to see the property and drive there. And I wish there was quite a few times over the course of out-of-state investing where I would have loved to been able to get on and drive down to it and say, well, I want to see this. I want to see what kind of is the roof really that bad? You have to replace it, or everything that they'll come about that in the course of just rental properties. But let me see, what was the second part to your question?
Tips you can give to other people who are looking at investing out of state, because a lot of people do it, a lot of people consider it, and there's no this is bad, this is good. It's all nuanced and pros and cons. Just advice for people considering out of state versus investing, locally or in their backyard.
Yeah, I would think that it's just getting harder and harder to do out of state, and it's just not as lucrative as it seems. And I found a lot of times they're also trying to sell you something if they're like a big proponent of like, oh, this is the new system, and this is what we can do for you and what we can offer you as turnkey providers or property managers or anything. So that's one thing. I think doing that, and then I realized like how much I really enjoy the options and control to be able to do that myself. So I think that's one of the greatest things about real estate, is that it has so many options open to you. It's like you can improve the property, or you can do several different strategies, or you can do it yourself, or if you don't want to, you can hire someone to do it, or mixture, and you can change it. So you're not set into any one of these strategies over time. That you can there's very few things that are other than completely selling the property, there's very few things that you can't change in the future and moving forward.
Yeah. And then Ken, I know that kind of I would say like a compilation of knowledge and experience sort of led you to your third Colorado Springs property. Can you give everyone a quick overview of that property and the strategy that you employed for it?
Sure. So once I got a little bit of a taste of the medium-term rental, and then I had set aside and just from the 1031 exchanges and some other things in progress, I was looking for another property to add to the portfolio. And I was really looking and centering that into the northern Colorado Springs market. And I think when we originally started looking for, because for the medium-term rentals and the type of people that would normally want to stay in medium-term rentals. So if you're thinking like traveling nurses and doctors, and it's usually a smaller number of people. So in that regards, 1 and 2 bedroom properties work much better, and they're lower price points and a higher ROI. So that's where I initially started looking for the medium-term rentals. And then also in northern Colorado Springs, which were a much better location for the medium-term rentals. And then after a while, I don't think we had too many properties that actually fell out of contract, or we just really weren't finding what we were looking for. And then I was looking also on a larger scale of what the market is doing. So at this time, it was pretty evident that the interest rates were going to rise. And then also the appreciation was really strong and anticipated to keep going. So if you only get to buy one property, I was looking more along the lines of, I moved it to looking at a 3-bedroom property, because a 3-bedroom townhouse it'll still work as a corporate rental. Might not be the best option, but it's very close to hospitals, universities, Air Force Academy, tons of businesses. So once we found that property, we were looking at incorporating kind of a trade-off between the appreciation, being able to lock in low interest rates, bearing in mind that I closed months ago. And I knew that, I wanted to buy pretty much a more expensive property in a really good location with a higher potential for appreciation, but then also being able to take advantage of the medium-term rental, which would increase the cash flow, but maybe not as well as a 2-bedroom. So then what I did too is, because I had knowledge of the medium-term rental, I underwrote it as a long-term rental as well. So then there was some consideration of, well, should I do 20 or 25% down? And really what I was looking at is the really low interest rates at that time. I see that as just a really big asset for a long-term debt to be locked in. So that's why I was looking to put as much down so I could bring the interest rate down, and then also lock that in so it would also perform as a long-term rental as well, because things can change. And then I'm not locked into the strategy of like, all right, now I have to do the medium-term rental and keep that going. So for me, having multiple options and multiple exit strategies after you have the property and setting that up ahead of time was very important to me.
And that's really, and as you said this a few minutes ago, Ken, that's nice about real estate, you have optionality. And especially now, since you're able to self-manage in the marketing in Springs, and you can drive the property with an hour or so, it gives you just more optionality as well. So what is a good way for people to reach out and ask your questions or pick your brain? Because I said, a big part of this podcast that Jenny and I do is to connect investors, connect people, help people learn, mastermind. So like, how can people reach out to you, connect with you, and just get to know you a little bit better?
Sure. Email and phone. We can put that in the show notes.
Cool. So you're good with both email and phone in there?
Yes.
Perfect.
That's
we will do that, and of course we will put details and numbers and transactions in the show notes as well. But I'm just very appreciative of you coming out, Ken. I know it was a lot to prep for. We appreciate your prep work on here, the numbers, and coming out to share the story, because it's very beneficial to other people. If anyone out there has questions or wants to perform a similar transaction or analysis of what they want to do with their portfolio, reach out to me and Jenny. I mean, this is stuff we love doing, that strategy coordination, helping you match up the right properties with the right strategy and the current market conditions. We love doing it. So go to the show notes, click out the investment consultation form, and we would love to chat with you. So Ken, thank you. Jenny, thank you. We'll see you guys next week.